Welcome to the Future of Internal Communication podcast. I'm Jen Sproul, CEO of the Institute of Internal Communication. Since we launched this series in 2021, the world of work has been disrupted by event after event. A pandemic, geopolitics, AI, extreme weather events, remote and hybrid working, generational shifts, inclusion, diversity. The entire nature of how we work needs transformation. This podcast explores opportunities for internal communication in the future of work. Internal comms is a critical function that helps organisations achieve lasting change, building trust and relationship between people in pursuit of shared goals. Please join me, Dominic Walters, and Kat Barnard as we dissect what this means for internal communication. With relentless change the new normal, it's time to reimagine our profession.
Hello and welcome to a fresh episode of the Future of Internal Communication podcast. I'm your host, Kat Barnard, and as ever, I am joined by Jen Sproul and Dominic Walters. I have to say, one of the best bits of producing this podcast is that I get to invite really interesting people to have conversations with. And mid-late last year, I came across a blurb of a book that really enticed me. And I immediately thought about you, our listeners, as internal communicators. I thought it would be of huge interest to you as well. So today, I want us to talk about the way we talk around here. And I'm delighted to introduce our guest, Gill Ereaut. She is a researcher, author, speaker, and organisational consultant, and founder of the consultancy Linguistic Landscapes, which has been going for more than 20 years. That business has pioneered the application of language sciences to real organisational issues. Just as a tiny aside, I am absolutely fascinated in this topic because I did a degree in modern languages and there wasn't anything like what we're going to talk about presently when I was at university. That does not mean that I am a dinosaur. It just means that this is quite a modern line of research and inquiry. Gill, as I say, is the author of a book called The Way We Talk Around Here: How Your Organisation's Culture Shows Up in Your Language and Why It Matters. And that book has already become an Amazon #1 bestseller. It's been highly commended in the People, Culture and Management category of the Business Book Awards in 2025 and won in the Stories and Conversations category of the Change Ninja Book Awards in 2025. Gill's background is in psychology. She's got degrees in psychology and contemporary cultural processes and has amassed more than 40 years' experience in business consulting. Best bit about your bio, though, by a country mile, as a lover of dogs, is that you live in Oxford with an oversized whippet who is in the background right now. So if they bark, apologies. So you live with your whippet and probably too many books, a person after my own heart. Gill, welcome.
Thank you very much, Kat. It's a pleasure to be here.
Really good to have you here for this conversation, finally. I read your book late last year, and as I say, with my language graduate head on, I was whizzing through it and just thinking, oh my goodness. I had so many kind of mini aha moments. It was to be believed. And so rather than try and give a really poor appraisal of your book, I wondered if you would be happy to start off by telling us about your work, which obviously led you to write the book. So tell us about your work and the trigger for writing the book.
Thanks, Kat. In fact, at risk of going too far back in the life history, it actually started probably 25, 30 years ago. I worked for many years as a consumer researcher in qualitative market research. And I've therefore spent a lot of time listening to people, which is great, customers, people, consumers, and taking insights from what those people said back into the client organisations who commissioned the work. And I love listening to people. I love, quotes, ordinary people are the most fascinating creative resource in the world. But what I got over the years, I got increasingly interested in the way that my client organizations talked internally, because many times go through this experience of sitting in a briefing meeting with a big organization, consumer brand. We're not talking sort of esoteric businesses. Listening to the way that they described their problem and the way they described their customers and the customers' lives, because obviously they're trying to design products to address those consumer needs. And I would sit there thinking, it's really interesting, the way you kind of have these solid concepts and constructs that are very real to you. And I suspect that when I go and talk to your customers, they won't have the same concepts at all. It won't be that they have a different name for the same idea. They just don't chop the world up into those categories. Their logic is very different. And that was often the case. So you go and talk to their customers, come back with insights and findings. And for the period of time it takes to present the work, an hour, maybe doing it a few times, the insight was clear to them. That's really helpful. That is a different way of thinking about our customers. We need to adjust our internal thinking to that. In my observation, that effects last about 3 months, then it dies. And what I was observing, and I couldn't put a finger on it then, but I knew that language was somehow implicated, that during that period of time, it was like the insights, the new understanding got sucked back into like the gravitational pull of the existing organizational language. I would now call it discourse. Discourse being the mix of language and thinking and language. They are kind of the same thing. When we talk a bit more, I know we will later, about discourse analysis itself, the important thing about it is language isn't a transparent medium through which we talk about a fixed reality, but language itself is part of creating that reality. So what I was observing were these internal realities. And what I was also observing was how wasteful this process was, because they would start making decisions and we'd sort of hear what they were doing and think, really? If you understood that probably wasn't going to land well, but they did it anyway. And then a few years later, of course, they'd come back and they'd ask for the same project to be done all over again. Because the need hadn't gone away, the opportunity hadn't gone away, but they hadn't been able to absorb it. And I just got very interested in internal organizational language. And I set out really to try and find a way to, if I could use my research skills, and I found this academic area that, as you said, Kat, was relatively new. I mean, it erupted in the mid-80s. If I could put those together and help organizations kind of see what they were doing to themselves, how they were getting in their own way, as some people would say, by having this very fixed internal reality with all these names and categories and ideas that were like a kind of set of paths in long grass or grooves, thinking grooves, into which any new information snapped quickly into the old grooves. So I started playing around with mixing approaches from academic language science with organizational problems to see what happened. And I had some lovely clients who were willing to experiment with me along the way. And from 2002 onwards, it just became very clear that there certainly was something powerful in taking that approach. Increasingly, the projects that I did moved from being help us communicate with our customers, certainly can do if you can understand where you're coming from internally. But they then moved towards, can you help us sort out our culture problem? We know we've got a culture problem. We can't quite define it, but can you help us do that?
There were so many bits in the book that really chimed with me. And please correct me, because I have a tendency to over paraphrase. But one of the things that stood out for me was an example that I think you gave, which is the migration in language within the UK's healthcare services, where we have in recent years stopped talking about patients and now we talk about service users, and what that does to the experience of the patient.
Yeah. There are a number of people sometimes say, what should we be looking out for in language? And as you will see from having read the book, there's a very rich sort of toolbox of linguistic features, if you like, to look for, and that can give you insight. But one of the most powerful ones is categories and labels. And, how something is categorized and what label it's given it can be quite a blunt thing, but it is very telling. Other forms of very powerful features to look out for would be pronouns. Who is the we around here and who is the they? And those we and they divisions are not always where you expect them to be. We've worked with, at the extremes, one organisation where almost pathologically everybody talks about we as the whole organisation. It was almost like a mantra, we always meant this enormous, as it happened, global organisation. And another organisation where we only ever meant my little team. There was no corporate we in people's discourse in their conversation. A single data point is not enough to draw conclusions, but they are very telling. Pronouns are very telling, not least because we don't really notice them. We don't notice them in use.
I think there's something really interesting in there also, because one of the pillars of theory in the future of work is that as these multiple meta trends converge upon one another, they will throw up challenges for organisations that differ from context to context, that fundamentally there will be no one playbook for the future of work, because the playbook will vary according to who's involved and what the circumstances are of a specific situation. And so we've had this in the last week or so in a discussion that we've had internally. It's impossible, absolutely impossible, and pretty naive actually, to assume that the future of work will play out multilaterally across countries in an identikit way, singularly because the cultural variances, country by country, continent by continent, business by business, business unit by business unit. There's so many layers of complexity that show up. And so it's interesting that you talk about the pronoun and the we, because who is the we? We know that in 2026, we've got multinational organisations operating across borders, across continents, etc. And in tandem, rising geopolitical frictions that are threatening supply chains, causing economic instability in certain territories, really darkening the prospect of war. And people have very diverse views on how they feel about those risk factors. And so the construct of we becomes quite problematic, doesn't it? Because who is we? And also, just to throw another layer in, all of us are pretty subject to mass media every day foreboding of prolific job losses to AI. And I don't know whether any of you guys have seen, but the Edelman Trust Barometer has just come out in the past week or so. And it's talking about how trust now is absolutely reduced to the most granular level of, I trust my friends and my very, very local community and the people that are directly around me. And therefore, this construct of we becomes almost comedic, doesn't it?
We could probably do a whole podcast on the idea of we and the boundaries.
Yeah.
But I think I'd just point to it really as a particularly good example of how the devil's in the detail in language. And we often don't notice things like pronouns. We don't notice sometimes how people use passive and active, and we feel them at a gut. We don't sort of notice them. But those are the things that if you kind of get your focal length right, you can start to look at language for what it's doing. Like not try and look through it at what people are saying, but actually look at how that language is being used, like the action, the work that particular language choices are performing to sustain a state of affairs or to create or disrupt a particular kind of relationship and so on. As I said, the toolbox and the set of concepts is very, very rich and diverse. I just wanted to play back to you, without criticism at all, the use of the word playbook. We have come to be very used to the word playbook in business or organizational life. But playbook, if I'm understanding it right, comes originally from American sport, comes from American football. And it's one of a whole set of a very widespread sporting metaphor, competitive sport metaphors that are used across business. I mean, and of course, the other one that people are very familiar with is that of warfare. But when we say playbook, I think we immediately place ourselves in essentially a competitive, combative kind of environment where we have to make our plans and here's our playbook and this is what we're going to do if they do this. And if you just, I mean, we use always the notion, it's an analytic thinking tool of the question, how could it be otherwise? How could that be said in a way? And what other kinds of terms could be used that would do a perfectly good job, but they would just carry a different weight and meaning? Not to say you should be using one of these other ones, but it allows you, how it could be otherwise allows you to see the work's being done by something like playbook. So how would it sound if we talked about an organisation's script, for example, rather than playbook? Then you're in a theatre, then you're sort of, people are still being given lines to say and so on. So it's not completely free form, but it just conjures a different kind of relationship, a different kind of set of relationships within an organisation. So that's I'm very nerdy about this kind of stuff, as you'd expect.
Oh my God. Honestly, I could nerd out with you for hours on this topic. However, I don't want to hog the mic too much, Dom and Jen.
No. But what's interesting, I think one of the things we talked about before, Kat, was like, why did I write the book? And I wrote it partly because having worked with this for 20 years, I kind of wanted to get the ideas out there and invite other people to be curious and to look into how else, I'd taken a particular way of turning this into a consulting business, but how else could you do it? But I also found increasing that some people often have an intuitive sense that language matters in an organization. They'll say things like, yeah, this is just kind of like weird how we talk around here, or it really, really matters. I can't quite, people can't quite get a grip on why it matters or how, but they can often give examples of, well, playbook might be something that somebody notices, or service user, and they can point to details, but they can't necessarily get hold of why does that bother them? Why is it disconcerting? And so I wanted to just spread this out in a way that allows people to play with it, so that this is not for everybody, because not everybody thinks that language matters that much. Oh, it's just language, just words. It was never just words, I would say. But if you don't think that language is ever just words, and I'm imagining that your listenership is probably of the view that language does matter because you spend a lot of time and care picking the right words, then you can go one step deeper into why does it matter and how does it matter and how can you pick apart what something is doing when you read it and think, oh, that sounds a bit icky, or oh, that sounded a bit aggressive, or whatever it is.
Gill, I'm going to join you and Kat and a bit of a nerd out about this because I love...
Nerdfest, yeah.
Nerdfest, that's the word, yes. I love all this stuff about language. So I guess it'd be really good to focus on the word culture because you've obviously mentioned it a few times. And in our experience, or my experience of working with this, it's a negative phrase. I only ever get the word culture back from people when they don't like it or when they're trying to pull together things about the organisation that they dislike. And I'm sure, like me, you've probably heard people quote at you a number of times. Is it supposedly Hermann Göring who said, when I hear the word culture, I reach for my pistol? It's not often we have Nazi people mentioned on this particular podcast, but it's an interesting quotation. Apocryphal, I'm sure, but a lot of people use it because they're disparaging about culture. And so it'd be interesting, first of all, to explore a bit about that. I guess a good starting place, Gill, is what's your definition of culture? What do you mean by culture? And how does it affect people?
Yeah, totally. Oh, let's leave Göring aside for now. I found myself working in culture through the route I described, rather than being a kind of cultural organisational theorist and so on. But of course, one pokes about and finds the way that culture has been theorised and often the way that it is spoken about and written about in mainstream business education. There are, I'm sure you know, approaches to culture that are described in big business schools, and they are the subject of consulting companies' products, and I'll come in and we'll do a culture diagnostic and so on. One of the things that has always bothered me is that culture is treated in that kind of discourse as a thing. It's an object. It's like another piece of the kind of organizational structure and assets. And it's treated as something that can be managed and controlled and dictated and changed just like that by directive from above, or that people can be persuaded through texts or workshops or whatever it is to change the culture. And it just doesn't seem to fit with how people actually experience culture, by which I mean the way it feels to work around here. And people, I think there is a really good reason why the expression, the way we do things around here, is the one that is so frequently used around culture. Because what that, to me, gets is the essence of what culture is, which is how we do what we do. The manner in which things get done. Something it's about like what we do, but it's the manner in which things get done. And that means that it's hard to get hold of it. And if you can't get hold of something and describe it accurately, you can't change it. Approaching a culture by saying, oh, we need to map the culture, we'll do a staff engagement survey, is almost always going to fail because culture drops beneath the level of consciousness. A story, something I often say, and if I'm talking with a group of people within an organization, to say to them, do you remember the first week or two you spent here, or at any other organization, or in any other group for that matter? For the first few weeks or months, you can hear the way it talks when you're new. People go, yeah, definitely have that experience. And then usually somebody will say, but I can't hear it anymore. It only takes a few weeks, months. Occasionally you get somebody who can still hear it. And what's happened when you have stopped being able to hear it is that in that language, when you first arrived, what you were hearing was effectively the expression of the culture. So if I think of culture as a sort of substrate, I'll talk about Edgar Schein in a minute, but the kind of silent, unspoken assumptions, the view of the world, the how we do things around here and how we think around here, it pops up into specific language. And even if you've come from the same industry and you go into a new organization, each organization has its own particular identity around that. And what happens is when you're new, you're in no position to comment. You just have to get on and learn it. It's not just a question of learning the jargon. What you're doing is learning the implication of this language. I boiled it down, and you'll see in the book, to 3 really fundamental questions that sit within culture. It's like, who are we and what we do and kind of what matters around here? That's number 1. Number 2 is, who are they out there, like the non-organization, those outside of us, whether they're customers, regulators, competitors, whoever it is. And what's the third thing is, what's the nature of the relationships that we establish with those out there and within the organization itself? So you've got really core ideas about identity and relation and relating that sit at that completely unspoken level. And when you first arrive, you're aware of this, but you have to just get on and work out how to operate within this organization. So you keep your job you've been given. But because people can't make that explicit, except when you're new, it fossilizes. It just becomes the way we do things. And so in helping an organization to change, the process that I developed is to allow them to see it. So to take everybody, if you like, back to that first day or first few weeks at work where they can hear it. Because what happens is it gets out of date. I'm just going to talk for a second about Edgar Schein. I'm sure many of your listeners will be familiar with Edgar Schein's model of organizational culture. It's simple, but it's really, really practical. And I think it's powerful. People recognize it very quickly. So Edgar Schein talks about a kind of 3-layer model of culture. So at the surface, you have what he calls artifacts, which are the things that are really easily observable in an organization, the way people sit and dress and the color that the reception area is. And you can also take into that idea like how the organization is structured and so on. Language is part of what he calls artifacts. I would say language is a super artifact. It has a very particular place and particular usefulness. Next layer down is what Schein calls espoused values. We ended up calling them claims and wishes. And those are the things that the organization says it believes in and says it values. And this is what an organization says its culture is. You know those things. Your listeners, some of them will be charged with writing those things and disseminating them, and they go on the wall at reception and so on. And then underneath both of those are things that are out of language. And that's what I was saying before, the unspoken silent assumptions. I think Schein calls them basic assumptions, and we tend to call them silent assumptions, unspokens, taken for granted, the norms. And the point really is that those are by definition not in consciousness. They're not Freudian unconscious. They just drop out of view through that process I described. But they're extremely powerful, because I would define, going back to your question, Dom, very convoluted way, one of the ways to think about culture is a set of absolutely unspoken rules of thumb. And I would express it often as, if in doubt, do this. If in doubt, what we do around here is this. Or if in doubt, some other people talk about culture as what people do when they're not being observed. You know, what your staff do when they're not being watched, which is has a bit of a sinister kind of quality to it. But if in doubt, do this, a simple rule of thumb. And so if you can excavate the nature of that, it often proves to be having once in the past been adaptive and useful. But the world has moved on. That thing hasn't shifted because nobody's really conscious of it. And it becomes out of date. And a lot of problems come from the unspoken culture just trundling along in its own sweet way, while the consciousness of the organization or the leadership, management, communications people are trying to make it different, but nothing is shifting because people can't change something they can't articulate or see or recognize. So what discourse analysis, this process of looking at language, allows us to do is to look at surface language, look at the artifact of language on the surface, also to look at the claims and wishes, the statements of values and strategy and so on, and hypothesize what must be there in order for this to make sense. So we wouldn't say this is your culture, but having sampled language and use these qualitative, largely approaches to thinking about and looking for patterns in that language, we would say, from the way you talk around here, it looks like these are your completely unspoken assumptions. And two questions then flow from that. Do you recognize it? And at this point, usually people have got their heads in their hands going, oh my goodness, we do, don't we? And often they will say, I completely recognize that pattern that you've shown us and I've never seen it before. I've never noticed it, but I completely recognize what you've just shown me. And that's very powerful for people. And then the second question after, do you recognize it, is how far is this helping you? Implications of this patterning of language pointing to the unspoken assumptions, rules of thumb, the if in doubts, how far is that still relevant to your business now? Because they get stuck. So it's a kind of clients often refer to it as holding a mirror up. It's like using everyday language that litters the place, notices on walls and emails and conversations that people have, using that as the data of culture, because it's very powerful data if you look at it in a particular way. I don't know if that quite answered your question, Dom, about how I talk about culture, but to what we do, not what we have, I think is the important thing.
I know that Jen will come on to look at discourse analysis more in a second, but can I just go back? So you mentioned about, I suppose most organisations, they work on the first two that you mentioned. So the look and feel of the place and the values they talk about. But clearly, as you said, the real culture is what's hidden, and that's what you help people understand and start to work on. But I guess even the hidden culture is the product of lots of people making the best possible decisions according to circumstances. So I don't suppose there are many that try and build up behaviours or language to be unhelpful. But they do these choices, these good choices for good reasons, that can then suddenly not work. So in your experience, why do you think lots of organisations do get the culture wrong? Because we know that they obviously do, and it must be almost by accident. But what in your experience, why is it?
It's a really good question. I think it's not so much they get it wrong, but they let it go wrong. You know, it's a bit like any kind of living creature, and a culture, not getting too fanciful about it, is a kind of living, breathing creature. It's being done all the time. It's how we do things. It's in conversations between people. It's in documents that are being exchanged. And that means that it can kind of creep off in a particular direction. And if you're not watching it, or I think worse maybe, if you kid yourselves that you're in charge of it, then it can get pockets of a particularly dysfunctional or even toxic kind of culture that a crew around maybe a couple of individuals can create a sort of subculture or a mini culture. But I think the mistake that organisations make is to treat it like a thing that can be managed, that they report on, and that is a reified object. I think you have to think of culture as relational and indeed conversational. You're probably familiar with some fairly radical work about organisations with about Ralph Stacey and Patricia Shaw, who talk about conversations as essentially being organisations. Organisations do not exist except in and through relationships and conversations. Yeah, there are factories. Yeah, there are, some hardware stuff. But essentially, organisations are about people in relation with each other, responding to each other in real time. I'd say it's quite a radical view, but I think I'm probably somewhere on that spectrum of it.
No, I think there's a lot in there. I will pass over to Jen in a second. But this whole thing about conversations, it lends itself to the ongoing debate about the role of internal communication. We have this ongoing debate about to what extent are we responsible for engagement. And clearly we're not solely responsible for engagement. We can do things which influence it. And I think it sounds like exactly the same with culture. As communicators, we have our hands on lots of different levers that can influence culture. But it sounds like no one actually is responsible for building the culture necessarily, but it's understanding it, being aware of it and its implications. And that's a really very helpful insight, I think.
Now go on, Jill, you're going to say something then?
Oh, well, I was just going to say, if you think about culture as a living, breathing thing, then I think I would talk about intervening in culture or joining a conversation rather than levers or change or, anything more kind of hard, because I'm not woo-woo about it. These are really serious sort of organisational issues that affect productivity. They affect the success of an organisation, however that's measured, whether it's public, private sector, whatever. But I think that the metaphor of an organisation as a machine that can be controlled is so clearly not helpful, but it is really appealing and people hang on to it. And I think one of the things that culture does is it kind of challenges that model, because as everyone knows, culture change is astonishingly hard. And I think it's hard because people have gone at it with that model that it's a thing that can be pushed, pulled, affected, and so on. But I think your internal communication is in a much better position to intervene, if you like, because you can join in that conversation, you can shape that conversation, you can introduce new topics in the same way we're doing in this podcast. We're taking it in turns because there are certain kind of rules and conventions about how we do it, but we're also, any of us can take the conversation off slightly. We can nudge it, in a particular direction, because it's a flowing, interactive, responsive thing. That's probably a bit too woo-woo for now, but let's go.
No, not at all, Jill. And I think there's so many of our listeners that will share that feeling and that emotion and the way that you've described it. And I think it's that thing about trying to see it as a system and a process that can't fit in a system or a process. It doesn't work in that way. As you say, it can't be grasped or grappled, but languages can be used as a way to understand the representation of that culture. But again, correct me if I'm wrong. And I think about internal communicators and what we're there to do. We talk a lot about how can we help create shared meaning, shared understanding, but we all emotionally respond to language in different ways as well. And I love it, seeing that thing that we can really analyze beneath the surface to think about the opportunities for us as internal communicators who really value the craft of language. They really value that craft of what it's come. And language, I feel like sometimes we're in a catch and release with language as well. Everyone's talking about this, let's catch that one. And then we go, it doesn't work, let's release it back to the wild and then we'll catch the next one. Rather than really getting beneath that unseen space that you've talked about. And I'm going to come back to this thing you talked about earlier about discourse analysis, because I think this is a really fascinating area for internal communicators to put into their armory to help think about how language and the work that we do can therefore drive outcomes and decisions in the business that really, whether that's a productivity outcome or whether that's a an appetite for risk or an ability to innovate or ability just to have relations and conversations that nudge and move things forward. So you talked a little bit earlier about it and this kind of, and obviously as internal communicators, we have so much access to words and how they're used in a business, if you like, and whether that's in a digital form or a human form. And you talked about it as a qualitative technique. Also, I think discourse is being used currently that's a way of describing disagreement, but this is a different.
So you see, that's how language works, it kind of evolves and yeah, exactly.
Is that catch and release? Well, no, actually, no, at the moment, we're talking about it in a whole different context. So can you, I guess, talk to me a little bit more, I guess, perhaps with that research methodology angle on about what does that look like as a qualitative research, but also outcome-driven decision-making process that can be helped to think about how language and communication can drive thinking and outcome or culture.
Just do a kind of tiny potted history of discourse analysis as a set of, and a lot of academics would be very unhappy with me saying discourse analysis like it was a single thing, because it isn't a single thing, but leaving that aside. It was an approach to language that emerged from the sort of mid-80s onwards in a number of different disciplines, social science disciplines largely. So you have it in psychology, sociology, media studies, history even. And it essentially takes the view that, as I think I said before, language isn't a transparent medium through which we talk about a fixed reality, but language itself constructs that reality. There is such a thing as a kind of hard table in front of me and so on. But so much of our world is actually constructed. So language does things, it creates realities. Language is action. So every time you make a choice in how you're going to say something, you are doing something, not just communicating something. Bear with me. And what's very interesting also about discourse analysis was it was and is used a lot to look at structures of power. One of the ways in which power is exerted is through the power to name or not name and to normalize and to naturalize. Well, of course, it's normal. We can see it historically. It was at one point completely natural that women should just not go out to work. As soon as they had a baby, they would just stay at home. I mean, that was a natural thing to do. And it's very unnatural for women to not do that. But the idea of naturalizing something is a way of holding in place a certain state of affairs. And it's linked, of course, with power, because any state of affairs has power attached to it. There are people who benefit from that state of affairs and people who don't benefit from it, and so on. So discourse analysis is a really, really powerful set of tools, and it has a lot of different specific analysis tools within it. And by tools, I mean frameworks for thinking. I think of it as if you're driving along, normally you're looking through your windscreen. You're just looking at what's out there, where am I going to go? And what discourse analysis allows you to do is to look at the windscreen. So you're not just looking at what is somebody saying to you or what are you trying to say to them, but you're looking at the thing through which you're saying it and you're making that visible. There's a lovely little chapter in a book that talks about language not as a window, but as a topic. So language itself, the choices that you're making in language becomes a topic in its own right, quite apart from what's the substantive content of what's being said. And when you guys, I think it will be very, I suspect there'll be lots of your listeners who will be going, yeah, okay, so I can look at the language. You're doing this intuitively anyway. Every time you write or rewrite something, because it doesn't sound quite right, or I need it to sound a bit more authoritative, or I need it to sound a bit more, whatever the brief is, or your brief to yourself. Every time you do that, you are using forms of discourse. You're choosing from within the huge array of language that we have, particularly in English, to choose from to get exactly that nuance right. And what discourse analysis allows you to do is to kind of codify what you're doing. And the trick, of course, and people sometimes get very upset that if you codify writing or language, you kill it. And my experience is you don't kill it. People get very excited at oscillating between the creative production of language and the analysis of language, because it opens up another way of seeing what the language is doing. And I have, honestly had clients get very excited about what it unleashes. And in fact, not just the commissioning clients, senior people, whoever it is, But by choice, we would normally present the findings of this work to a very large swathe of people from across the organisation at once, 200-300 people in a room, ideally, because there's something about people suddenly seeing something that has been hidden from them, but that makes sense to them, that's very energizing. And what you need in change is energy, isn't it? To change anything, you need some kind of poof. I mean, Lewin talks about unfreezing, but that's a bit kind of mechanical. And I know it's not the best model, but having that kind of sudden realization that the status quo is not serving any of us very well, no matter what level in the organization. We do need to change ourselves in order to keep up with customers, in order to whatever it is that we have to do, is very allows a kind of release of energy. So I think it's a very interesting technique. There are semi-quantified approaches within it. I mean, looking at corpus linguistics, which has a relationship with LLMs, but it's not the same thing at all. But looking at how language is used kind of in real life out there in the wild can be very revealing. We understand the implication of somebody using a particular word, because in the dictionary, well, that's a nice little innocent word. That doesn't mean anything nasty, does it? But when you look at how it's used in practice out there in the world, you see that in common usage, it doesn't mean that at all. It means something quite unpleasant and so on. That's not a great example, but I don't know if that answers what you asked me about discourse analysis, Jen.
It does. And it makes me think of even more things, and as a tool, as you say, a framework that could really empower the internal communication community. Because as you say, I think that the work we have is relational as well as conversational, right? And also as well, you talk about change and this whoosh of energy that we need. And we know that organizations want people to change and adapt and adopt, should I say, at a significant pace. And they can't understand the frustration of why that doesn't happen, because perhaps they're trying to put, as you said at the very beginning of this podcast, thinking into the old grooves rather than finding the new grooves of doing things. And I think that the language is sort of kind of amorphized in many ways. And we talk a lot about, as internal communicators, the power of listening, right? And obviously from research, is the power of observing as well as not intervening on that. And also then understanding the relationship of language between the corporate world or your business or your professional world to your consumer world, to your, I'm Jen and I'm your friend and I'm a human world, right? And I would certainly say that as you talk out loud and you think about the wild language, as in language out in the wild, and then language we find ourselves confined to in the workplace, they feel very different. I wouldn't use workplace language in my wild world. I don't know if that makes any sense, but I hope you're following me. But I think analysing the two side by side gives you an understanding of where that gap of humanity is not creating that connection of the dot for a shared meaning and creation of a new groove. And I think that's a really powerful way to think about that. And I would say as internal communicators, if you're looking at your methodologies, going back to that sort of question of the methodology aspect of discourse analysis, and the phrase you said earlier is data into the world of your culture, maybe, there is an abundance of data out there to us that we can collect and we can mine and we can codify, where you take from what's happening in observational circumstances, so you're not enforcing that, to what's happening naturally, to what you're seeing over here, to what's happening in the wild, to how language has moved forward and how that can be mapped to outcomes that aren't happening. I'm getting over nerdy at the beginning. This is what I'm getting over nerdy, and I'm okay with that. So I guess it's kind of, if people are listening right now and they're thinking, oh, I'm really worried about this thing, and maybe that's a key I could unlock in my practice and the work I'm doing. And maybe by doing this, I can shed light on some problems that we're not overcoming and some challenges that we're not solving. How do you start that way of, what would be a small thing you would say, go away and have a think about this? And that might unearth something super powerful that you can help shed light to as a business that can move it forward.
There are a number of quite sort of fertile parts of speech or language features. I mean, I mentioned pronouns before. I would say to somebody, like, have a notebook and just notice anything. Just listen to the language, not what the language is saying. Listen to the language. Where there's choice, there's meaning, always. So where, people are choosing to say it this way rather than that way, there's always a kind of reason for that. They may or may not be conscious of it. It doesn't really matter. But that's where culture erupts all the time, in those sort of non-conscious choices. So I would say pronouns, like who's the we, who's the they. Looking at labels, which we touched on before. Sometimes people notice, apocryphally, I think it's an apocryphal tale. There was an American investment bank where a category of customer were routinely referred to as Muppets, the Muppets. Oh, we've got a meeting with the Muppets this afternoon. Now, you can absolutely hear the disrespect in that. But that's an extreme. But coming back from there are an awful lot of ways that, for example, customers get talked about, or competitors or other groups get talked about, which you might notice, particularly when you're new. I would say to anybody, when you're new in an organisation, when you're new in a team, perhaps you're as internal communicators are working with a new division within an organisation, keep the notebook. You don't have to work out there and then why it's important or why you've noticed it. Just notice it and write it down, because what we're looking for always are patterns. So pronouns, labels, metaphor, we've touched on metaphor a few times, very extremely powerful. Can you suddenly realise that everybody in this meeting is using sporting metaphors, or everybody in this meeting we've suddenly started talking about us as a family, or XXX. And I think later, what does that mean? How does that fit in with everything else I know about this organisation? There are particular forms of language which, again, would be quite easy to spot when you kind of get your ear in, like parent-child relationships. We worked with one organisation where the parent-child dynamic was so profound. You just saw it everywhere. We collect a lot of data and we're looking for patterns. They're often like low signal to noise ratio, but in this particular place, the parent-child thing went ping, ping, ping everywhere. So even, there was a kind of top-down directive voice, but even people at much lower levels, if they were writing an email to colleagues, they would use a parental kind of, you must do this kind of tone. Notices on the walls everywhere were in that kind of finger-wagging parental kind of voice. It's important, you must wash up your Clayton mug. And there were 2 such notices above the same sink. Individual data points don't do it, but when you start to see that pattern. So parent-child discourse, things like narratives, of course, if there is a pervasive narrative in this organisation. I talk in the book about a particular organisation where there was a narrative. They didn't call her the bad queen, but she was very clearly in that role. She'd been a past leader who had done something quite profound to the organisation, the effects of which were still being felt and suffered from. And so, the whole narrative about how she had been the wrongdoer and they were all, suffering the effects. All of these just give you a kind of another way of thinking about what's going on, another way of making sense of what you're seeing or the tasks you're being that people are struggling to perform, whether it's you or somebody else. What's in the way here? Well, maybe what's in the way is that nobody can get past this narrative, and that maybe it's helpful. I would always say it's helpful to see it first and then think collectively about how to change it, rather than you kind of pushing in a new narrative. You might have some success doing that, but if you can help the whole organisation or large numbers of people recognize that narrative is important, it's being perpetuated, and maybe it's not helpful anymore, then you open up space for people to, often you find people are really happy to say goodbye to it. People who have felt that it's not, in their gut, that's not helpful, but haven't, because it's normal, they haven't been able to break out. So that kind of thing, I guess. Does that help?
Massively, yes. Thank you. Really helpful. Thank you.
Good. Your listeners especially will have the linguistic ears and the linguistic ability to be able to think about and categorize some of those things that they hear. And as I say, look for patterns. One thing I would always say, which I don't think I've had a chance to say, is I feel very strongly that in analysing culture and advising organisations on culture, this is not a blame game. This is not a finger-pointing exercise. To go back to something Dom said earlier, you can get quite toxic people, who are just quite unpleasant or out for whatever it is. But most people come to work not wanting to make difficulty for other people. They really do. Most people come to work wanting to be part of the success for the organisation. I may be a bit Pollyanna-ish, but that is how it is. And what organisations get stuck, though, because of that process I talked about, that the only people who are really aware of the culture are the newcomers and they can't comment, etc. So if you can hold a mirror up to an organisation and say, from the way you talk, it looks like this is what's going on. What do you think? And it's no one's fault, by the way, because you all absorbed this. You all became acculturated when you joined. However, if you then can see it and understand it and people still don't do anything about it, then it starts to become a question more of accountability. You do understand this now, so let's crack on and do something about it. Obviously, if there's a senior person who comes in or people who come in and think this is really weird the way we talk about customers around here, or, I really don't like the way we always talk about X, then they can start to intervene and do things. But for most people, that's not an option open to them.
I just want to chip in. I think now that you've told us, well, I picked this up obviously in the book, and I would recommend the book to anybody working in internal communication. It's not a lofty read. You will get through it and your brain will be fizzing with insights and ideas. Now that we've heard this, it's almost impossible, isn't it, to conceive of a place where culture is not shaped by language. Now, I'm going to tell you a little story where I had a big aha moment from reading your book. Those who listen to this podcast will know that I do an awful lot of writing for the IOIC, and we've produced a number of reports and white papers and discussion documents and so on. And one of the things that I think I was made aware of early on in my career is that business language differs from the language that we use with our friends in the pub. And actually, having studied French and Italian, I remember being very, very daunted by the prospects of doing business in France and Italy, because while I was more than able to pick up the phone and have a conversation with somebody in either of those two languages, the idea of writing in business French or business Italian was somewhat different. And actually, this is really boring, but I think it's the Collins Dictionary. The translation dictionaries actually have separate dictionaries for business French, business Italian, right? So when I was reading the book, you made the point, Gill, that business language is heavily influenced by Napoleonic language structure, whereas our vernacular is more influenced by Old English. Now, I don't want to go into Old English because that just gives me Chaucer willies, and that's just giving me the heebie-jeebies. But that really struck a chord for me because it made me think about the way that we write for professional audiences or the way that we write for business audiences. And actually, as I was reading what you had to say in the book, I was thinking about the way in which contracts and legal English is really quite onerous and an acquired taste. You have to have learned to read contracts to be able to skim through them quickly. Otherwise, they are very, very onerous. And I was saying, so my business partner and I met at university doing the language degree, and I was fizzing and saying to Patrick, oh my God, you have to read this book to see it, to believe it. This key point about the difference between colloquial English and business English. At which point his husband chipped in and said, yeah, no, the whole of the public sector had to rewrite their literature to reflect the language that their, inverted commas, service users would be familiar with. And it was just the biggest aha moment for me, because I went from thinking, oh, this is how we write around here because we're business professionals and therefore sentences need to be structured in this way, to a completely different appreciation of who are we writing for. And if you then factor in lots of people don't read in the same way that we would read or appreciate language in the same way that we would appreciate it, it really does change the game. So, and that was literally like, it hadn't even occurred to me that the way that business language is structured, A, has changed in certain circles to meet the needs of modern audiences, and B, I couldn't see the water that I was swimming in. And I think that's really apposite for the change that is thrust continuously upon all of us.
There's we could do another half an hour probably on Anglo-Saxon versus Norman Conquest language, but it is such a useful thing to understand that when I say Anglo-Saxon, I don't mean Chaucer, I mean the language of pig, dog, horse, stab, wife. That's Anglo-Saxon, and it was a spoken language. I think we're not technically supposed to call it Anglo-Saxon anymore, but that's what we understand. And that was not written down. And then come the Norman Conquest, written language and law to all of the institutions of high status and power, so law, finance, royalty, and so on, were French. And so a lot of our highfalutin language is Latinate, as in not Latin, but Latinate. It's based in Old French or whatever. And we almost always in English have an Anglo-Saxon equivalent. We have a real luxury in English of being able to have these sort of dual vocabularies. And that means that if you want to be clear and for people to immediately understand what you're writing, speak it and write down what you just said and then edit it a bit. Your point is right, Kat, that not everybody can deal with more complex language, but even extremely highly educated people are often the busiest people, have the most stuff coming at them. Nobody ever said, I didn't want to read this because it was too easy, because it was too clear. If they just say that, even busy, educated people really appreciate material that is clear. And one of the royal roads to clarity is to use simpler Anglo-Saxon-based vocabulary where possible. I'll stop ranting because I do rant about this.
No, Jill, it's a really good rant if rant's the right word. Is rant an Anglo-Saxon word? It sounds like it should be.
I think it should be, yeah, definitely.
I mean, we talk about this a lot with leaders and about the simplicity, and it's one of the biggest pushbacks that you get from leaders is, hey, look, if I use simple language, people will think I don't understand the full complexity. I don't get the difficulty behind this. I'm not clever enough, all that sort of stuff. We get quite a lot of those things. We need to come into land, to use a metaphor we use quite a lot, and I'm starting to analyse all the phrases that we use on this podcast. But it'd be great, you've covered such fantastic areas. When it comes to internal communication, particularly those going through change, what do you think is one or two things they should be taking from this, other than to read your book, which would be very sage advice? But apart from that, what else should they be doing to start to bring some of your principles to life?
Around change in particular, you mean?
Yeah, around change, or anywhere actually, but let's focus on change, yeah.
I think what my perspective, the book, etc., would allow many of your many comms professionals to do is to, as I think I mentioned, sort of codify what you kind of already know. Your instinct will get you, your professional instincts will get you writing, generally speaking, in a clearer way. What understanding the forms of discourse and the implications of discourse will do is to give you a whole set of arguments to have that conversation with that leader who doesn't want you to write like that. It's often the case that the professionals out here know exactly what the audience needs, but there's a kind of, I mentioned before, kind of gravitational pull that comes from the way we've always done it around here, the way I need to present myself, as a leader, as a whatever. The violence done to contemporary communications by 1950s English teachers is is legion, because Mr. Smith said we could never start a sentence with an and or a but. Therefore, we can't. Well, actually, we can. And if you do it, that and other things. So there's a whole area of, in the book, I talk about dialogic, which is a fancy way of just saying conversational language. But importantly, we don't mean text speak or slang or anything nasty with emojis. We just mean using the structures of spoken language on the page, because we construct language in a very different way, including the use of simpler, older vocabulary, but not just that. And when you transfer some of those onto the page, then the thing starts to sing. So I don't know if it's a full answer to your question, Dom, but I would say get conversant with being able to codify and talk about why this is going to help the communication. I'm sure there is evidence, I could probably ask somebody to help find it, that the more educated they are, and in a sense, the more important they are, the more they appreciate clarity of writing. There are many, many secretaries of state who these days will not read a paper that's longer than a side or 2 sides. There's too much coming at them. And if you can get your point across on a side or 2 sides in clear, straightforward language, you'll get read.
Yeah, because people just switch off, I guess.
Yeah.
We do need to come into land, but that's a great way to do so because it's a fantastic piece of advice. Gill, thank you for a fascinating conversation. I'm going to be watching not just what I say, but how I say it, looking through the windscreen and at it. So if I have a crash in the next few weeks,
don't get too self-conscious or you'll fall off. Yeah.
Thanks a lot, Gill. Thank you.
Yeah, very welcome. Thank you for the invitation. It's been a great conversation. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening today. If you like what you've heard, please like and follow us wherever you access your podcasts.